Historian and author John Gurda is my special guest next on I Remember Milwaukee. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember Milwaukee. Joining me tonight for a return appearance is John Gurda, author and historian. He's given lectures and written over a dozen books on Milwaukee neighborhoods, churches, corporations, you name it. During John Gurda's last appearance, by the way, we talked about his book, The Making of Milwaukee. It's a narrative of how the character of our city developed. John, the city has a long history. We left off somewhere around the Panic of 1857, I think, as I remember.
We may have gotten that far.
I think we did, from the primordial ooze forward, which really, your book is wonderful. I will say that absolutely honestly, and starts at the very beginnings, sort of the things crawling out of the swamp, and brings us up to modern times.
Oh, well,
but
Jim.
Let's pretend we ended it with a Panic of '57 and go into the Civil War. The Civil War is very controversial here in Wisconsin, which I was not aware of.
Certainly was. You had a fire-eating abolitionist as governor, a man named Alexander Randall, after whom Camp Randall, his name, where the Badgers play. Mm-hmm. And Milwaukee was a largely Democratic city, and the politics at the time, Lincoln was a Republican, and he did not carry Milwaukee.
Really?
Either 1860 or 64.
Wow.
So you have those kinds of opposition set up, but before the war began, there was an attempt on Wisconsin's part essentially to overturn on its own the Fugitive Slave Act, which was passed back in 1850.
How did we do that?
Well, we simply declared it unconstitutional. You know,
Makes perfect sense.
A state Supreme Court said, no, we won't follow that one. And Randall was determined that we would not help Southern slave owners recover their slaves on Wisconsin soil. And there was a militia company called the Union Guard, who were run by Garrett Berry, who was a Democratic politician, among other things. And he said that if he had to choose, he would have to uphold, the Constitution and fight for the United States. That was enough for Randall, who disbanded and disarmed the Union Guard. He took all their guns away. So these guys couldn't march around the streets of Milwaukee anymore. And the sad aftermath is that the Union Guard chartered a side-wheel steamer called the Lady Elgin in 1860 to go down to Chicago on a trip to see Stephen Douglas, who was their spear bearer in that presidential campaign.
Sure, Lincoln-Douglas debates.
That's right. And to come back, they had dancing on the way back, but it was essentially a fundraiser to try to get money for arms so they could reform.
The Lady Elgin was a very well-known.
It was a real popular excursion steamer, kind of the coastwise trade, passenger trade. I suppose it would be like the Milwaukee Clipper of a more recent period, or the
you and I are the only people who remember that.
The Edelweiss,
Okay,
a few people who recall that more recently. And while they were heading back to Milwaukee at night, they were rammed by a lumber schooner off Winnetka, and they sank with everyone on board. 300 people of the 400 passengers lost their lives. Wow. Very heavily Irish character to that loss. There were others, German firemen, they were lost, militia, or member of parliament who was visiting town.
From England.
From England, went down with the Elgin as well. But the greater losses were sustained by the Third Ward Irish.
Which really decimated that population, didn't it?
Probably literally. Probably perhaps 1 in 10 in terms of what they lost. And that's often said to have been a real setback for the evolution of the Irish in Milwaukee. When you look at the list of judges in Milwaukee today, they've done pretty well.
Yes.
They're certainly a presence, a power in Milwaukee politics and our public life in other ways as well.
We have risen again, yes. Right. That's a fascinating story. So we opposed the Civil War. There were draft riots around here, as I recall.
Not so much in Milwaukee. There were some up in Port Washington.
I think of that as part of Milwaukee, but obviously those days that was quite a distance, wasn't it?
It was. And for a lot of the immigrants, these people had come over from Europe to avoid having their sons drafted into the Army. They come to America, and the same thing's happening again. So they were somewhat less than enthusiastic about supporting the Union even in the Civil War, with the exception, the prominent exception of the 48ers.
Who were the 48ers?
The free-thinking, liberal Germans, intellectuals, philosophers, artists, painters. And they, as a body, marched off to war because it was a war for freedom.
How things have turned about. You don't generally think of that group of people as leading the vanguard for war.
No, not necessarily.
Exactly. But was the Civil War, I mean, eventually we got into it, and the Wisconsin, the Iron Brigade and all that was served with distinction,
Sure,
and we
did.
had a terrible loss of life, as I remember.
Certainly did, yeah, and Wisconsin certainly held up its end during the Civil War. Milwaukee, being the more heavily Democratic city, was probably somewhat less enthusiastic. But once the war was on, when you have these two sides pitted against each other, there was no question about where the real loyalties lay.
And it must have been good for business.
It certainly was, as any war is fought on someone else's territory. You have all the trade routes disrupted. The Mississippi, is closed to navigation, and that had been a prominent route to the south. Traffic was diverted to the west, including places like Chicago and Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. So it was certainly a real business stimulus for this whole part of the world.
Was that sort of the beginning of the growth of the railroads in this area?
No, that happened earlier, Jim. Probably 1851.
Okay.
Around that time is when you have the first railroad from here all the way to Waukesha. 30 miles an hour.
That far.
They're rolling out to the west. But that was a period when you had dramatic rail growth as well, which really helped to cement Milwaukee's role as a trader of grain. 1862, during the war, 1862, Milwaukee becomes the largest primary shipper of wheat on the whole planet. We were the funnel for all this grain that was pouring in from especially Wisconsin, but also Minnesota, Iowa, and finally the Dakotas. It all came, a great portion of it came through Milwaukee. What
were the other industries, enterprises, businesses that benefited and really started to grow about that time?
Not so much from the Civil War perspective, but around that time, just sort of the natural evolution of Milwaukee, you have a turn from commerce, just shipping things through, to adding the value here. And a lot of the farm products were processed in Milwaukee and then shipped elsewhere to become really part of our economic base. The farms grew wheat, we milled flour here. The farmers raised livestock. We became a major meat packing and tanning center. So the cattle were disassembled, into two major industries here.
That's a gentle way of putting it.
We were the largest tanner of plain leather on the face of the earth.
No kidding.
Back in the later 1800s. And a lot of that was German craftsmen, names like still familiar, Pfister, Vogel, Trostel, Galoon, had come here with those skills and became really the founders of a major industry here.
So it was the natural products that we had here that we made use of?
Beer, hops, barley, grown out in the countryside. Germans here knew how to make it and certainly had a taste for drinking it. So we become, before long,
we haven't lost that.
Beer. No, still here, still with us.
Crossed
all sorts of ethnic lines too.
Yes, so people had kind of home brewing and things like that. When did beer start to become an industry?
Probably by the 1850s. 1856, Milwaukee has 26 different breweries, and those were more than home breweries. They were largely, I suppose you'd call them almost microbreweries today, because they were largely a local market. But then after the Civil War, when you have refrigeration in rail cars and bottling plants, so you have a long-lived product, brewers like Pabst, who became the nation's largest back in 1873, are shipping as far as the Sandwich Islands, which was the old name for Hawaii.
Yeah.
So they developed a national and finally international market.
That's how Milwaukee became famous.
It did. Well, advertising.
You mentioned Pabst. Who were the other players?
Pabst and Schlitz were the two big ones. The third largest was Blatz, no longer with us. And the fourth largest brewery in the 1870s and 80s was the Falk Brewery. And you look at the huge gear plant down there in Menominee Valley today, they're still the nation's largest manufacturer of precision industrial gears. The father of that company's founder was a man named Franz Falk, who founded the Bavaria Brewery back in 1856, and he became the fourth largest in the city. So there were some really interesting connections between the old processing industries like beer and later on manufacturing.
You mentioned we milled the flour, and mills I always think of in some sort of, next to the river and the big wheel going around. Where would that have happened here?
It was next to the river where the wheel went around.
Oh, right. I knew that, of course. Yeah.
There was a lot of that along the Milwaukee River. They had early on what they called the water power, which was Byron Kilburn's Canal on the west bank of the Milwaukee River below the North Avenue Dam down to around what's now say Juneau Avenue, just a bit north of Juneau Avenue. And that provided the source of water power that turned the wheels that ground the wheat that made the flour.
They built the home that Jack built, yes.
And that stretch was the milling center
Really?
in Milwaukee.
How many mills were there?
Boy, probably a half dozen. It's pretty good sized ones. And that was a major industry here until wheat culture moved west as we wore out our soil. And a lot of the wheat farmers here had worn out the soil in New York State. So they just moved one step farther west. And what happened is the whole culture moves out to Minnesota and the Dakotas, and Minneapolis becomes the grain miller. And today, what General Mills, Pillsbury, are up there. That's where their roots are. So it was kind of the natural migration of the wheat culture west.
Every once in a while, weird things jump into my brain as we're talking. And for some reason, I started thinking about Milwaukee, West Allis. Was there ever an East Allis?
There was.
Or an Allis?
Just an Allis.
Was there?
It was Edward P. Allis, and he's really a pivotal figure in terms of Milwaukee becoming an industrial power, kind of moving from that processing side to manufacturing. Back in 1861, he buys a bankrupt machine shop, and a few years later puts it on essentially scows and moves it down the Milwaukee River to what's now Walker's Point, around First and Florida. Now a lot of bars there, a lot of very active nightlife in that area. And he found something called the Reliance Works. He makes steam engines, sawmill equipment, eventually water pumps, and he becomes sort of the industrial founder of Milwaukee way back in those years. His shop's down there on First Street, and he dies in the 1880s at a time when his shop was just about, if not the largest, one of the largest employers in Milwaukee. His sons, looking for room to expand, buy land out on 70th and Greenfield. And 1901, Allis Chalmers is incorporated. You got this huge plant out there. So what do you call that area? You've got the Allis plant on First Street in Walker's Point. So that's West Allis.
That became West Allis.
Yep. And until it's probably 7 or 8 years ago, there was a rail stop that you could hardly see it. You had to sort of be really looking carefully and sort of poking around that old industrial section of town. But at the top of the stairs between two sets of tracks was some kind of a terminal that said Allis on it. It was the Allis stop on that railroad, no longer with us.
Was his company the Milwaukee Iron Company?
No, Milwaukee Iron Company was something else down in Bayview, and that became the best known later on as the Illinois Steel Company. And that really, Allis was a machine kind of guy. He made things that worked. In terms of very heavy industry, the Milwaukee Iron Company goes back to 1868, and it stood at what's now the south end of the Danholm Bridge in Bayview.
Really?
And that became the real turning point for Milwaukee, moving toward the processing to heavy manufacturing as its stock in trade. By about 1875, that plant had 1,500 workers.
Wow.
Which in the year 2000 that's a lot of folks.
Yeah.
It's the size of, say, a Falk or a Laddish today.
Must have been enormous at the time.
Covered 80 acres. It was right around, if you can place the south end of the home bridge around the Coast Guard station, the Marine Naval Reserve station there, nothing exists that marks the site of that mill, with the exception of the neighborhood to its south, which is Bayview, because Bayview developed literally as a company town dependent on that iron mill for its employment.
It's astonishing, and I never had heard of it till I was reading in your book. What happened to it?
They lasted until 1929. They were the nation's second largest manufacturer of iron rails by the 1870s, so they were important nationally, as well as in this region. And what happened basically is they're purchased by United States Steel, who around the turn of the century is putting all its eggs in the Gary, Indiana basket. And by that time, the Milwaukee mill's 32 years old, and it didn't get any more technologically up to date as the years passed. In 1929, it was obsolete. It was kind of a scrap mill, short runs, odd jobs, and they closed it. And the city and U.S. Steel kind of bumped heads for about 10 years, and finally a settlement was reached. It became city property and sort of a green space, a park of sorts, and now the southern terminus of the Hone Bridge and the beginning of the Lake Parkway.
Wow! I just think of the history that's sitting Where that bridge, and nobody knows about
under
it.
the ground. When they were working on the Lake Parkway, they did some relocation of sewer lines, and there were a bunch of sort of scavenger types, myself included, were poking around the site, and there were large pieces of slag, pieces of the foundations of that mill, and I have a fire brick from the old open hearth, or the blast furnace, not open hearth, blast furnace on that site. So
you do a lot of this sort of thing?
No, I try to stay more working with the printed record.
I see, yeah, but we've never talked about that before, but have you been in on some of these kind of dig things? I talked to Russ Zimmerman, and he used to go around salvaging windows and mantles and stuff like that when they were tearing down the beautiful mansions on Prospect.
Not so much, Jim. What I collect largely is the information. I don't have much of a collection of artifacts at all.
What were some of the other manufacturing? 1929, it ended, and you immediately think of the Depression, but that apparently wasn't really the catalyst that ended. It was just out of date. Okay. Depression hit Milwaukee how hard?
Real hard. 1932, 33 is when things bottom out, and for a period there, late 20s. So the crash is October 29, and it took a while for that to kind of percolate, through the economy. And Milwaukee, for a time, 3031, was felt to be among the most stable metropolitan areas in the entire country. There's a cartoon in the book of the Milwaukee Miracle, where Milwaukee, the city, had paid all its debts and still had money in the bank. So we felt the local feeling was that we had such a diversity of industry here that even though you'd get a hit in one area, you'd had enough to keep you buoyant in all other areas. What happened was the whole manufacturing sector was just floored like a ton of bricks, Milwaukee and nationally, and because we were so heavily reliant on manufacturing, Milwaukee ended up suffering more, I think, on average, though, than the rest of the nation. Unemployment of 40% at some points.
Just think of that. You talked about something like that today, and people would go berserk.
1932, half of the city's property taxes went unpaid because people didn't have the money to pay them. So it was really very straitened economic circumstances.
What kind of government do we have then? We had passed through the Hone period. How did the socialists get such a firm grip on Milwaukee?
Boy, it's a story easily told in stages, Jim. When you go back to that Illinois Steel Company mill down there in Bayview, back in 1886, there was a general strike for the 8-hour day without a cut in pay. And that mill was the center of the most dramatic disturbances. Around 1,500 workers marched on that mill during a general strike in Milwaukee, May 5th, 1886. And by that time, the governor called out the militia. The Haymarket affair had taken place the night before, May 4th, in Chicago. So tempers were really, or emotions were really running high.
Number of people were killed.
Well, the militia opened fire when the workers were about 150 yards, or a long way away from the actual mill site, and at least 5 people died. So it was the bloodiest labor disturbance in Milwaukee and Wisconsin's history. And that was the catalyst for workers to organize, and in the very next elections in 1886, they swept virtually the county offices, sent a millwright named Henry Smith to Congress on the People's Party ticket, the Populist Party. So Mr. Smith went to Washington as a confirmed laborite. And the very next election, the old parties ganged up and outnumbered the populists. So that ended that first period. But that was the first step in a very worker-oriented, class-conscious political philosophy that becomes socialism. 1890s is when, under Victor Berger, that becomes an electoral power. And 1910, Emil Seidel becomes Milwaukee's first socialist mayor.
And killing all the fun that Mayor Rose had allowed us to have.
Yeah, it was easy to be nostalgic about David Rose. He was mayor for 10 years from 1898 to 1910. Nickname was all the time Rosie.
Yep.
And this was a guy who defended prostitution, said men always have been men and have their natural passions which must be gratified. He looked at least neutrally, if not kindly, on all-night gambling dens, the so-called stall saloons. And by 1906, around that period, there had been grand jury indictments returned against, I think, 83 individuals in or around his administration, 276 indictments. And the prosecutor called him the self-appointed Attorney General of Crime in Milwaukee. So it was, now you look back at that period as fairly colorful, but it was thoroughly corrupt. Everything was for sale.
So Emil Seidel and the socialists came into power in 1910 and cleaned things up.
Really cleaned things out. You look at Milwaukee today, and I think it's a Wisconsin phenomenon to some degree, but certainly in Milwaukee, we tend to take good, clean, honest, efficient government for granted. And people who take postage stamps from their campaigns, are pilloried in the press. There are certainly exceptions, but things are run cleanly here. And that is not the way it has always been. Before Emil Seidel, before the socialists, Milwaukee was just as corrupt as Chicago on a bad day. And
in fact, Chicagoans used to come up here for a good time, as I remember reading.
Good convention city.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Mayor Rose. Dan Hone, fascinating character. Mayor for how long?
24 years.
24 years.
1916 to 1940. Seidel is in office for 2 years, and then again, the old line parties, Republicans and Democrats, gang up and outnumber the socialists. Hone happened to have a 4-year term as city attorney, so he sort of sat out that purge and became the standard bearer in 1916 and won. Not by a landslide, but won, and stayed in office for what was a record until Henry Meyer passed it with 28 years.
Wow. And what kind of a mayor was Hone? Is he a good mayor?
He's, in my view, probably the best Milwaukee mayor ever.
Really?
The best in our history. It was during Hone's administration that Milwaukee really developed its identity as the best governed large city in America. And some of that was just very simply good housekeeping, paying attention to details. Milwaukee won multiple awards in terms of fire safety, public health, pedestrian safety. One contest we had to be taken from competition to give someone else a chance. This was a well-administered city, and a lot of that credit goes to Hone.
Couldn't we have done better than a bridge that doesn't go anywhere?
A little later. A little later story.
Hone was defeated by Carl Zeidler.
Right.
Very different from his brother Frank.
Right, very.
Carl was a flamboyant, fun guy.
Real type A.
Yeah.
And someone who may very well have moved on to higher office had he not lost his life during World War II as was an escort for a convoy, a merchant marine convoy out in the South Atlantic is where he lost his life. Certainly ran the first of the media campaigns. If there had been TV back then, he would have been considered a very telegenic candidate. Saying "God bless America" at the drop of a hat.
I remember those stories.
Stories about him showing up at, say group residences on the east side and knocking on the door and saying, "I'm Carl Zeidler, and do you have a piano?" Just wherever 2 or more gathered, he was apt to lift his voice in song.
I remember teasing Frank Zeidler one time. I said that, I can remember growing up hearing people say, that son of a gun would never have been elected mayor, and people thought they were still voting for his brother Carl. And Frank laughed and said, "That's probably true." Frank Zeidler, very different, and a socialist again.
He goes back to that more the Hone period. I think the term I used for Carl Zeidler was he was innocent of ideology. This was not someone with a well thought out political program.
That's a gentle way of putting it.
Frank, on the other hand, during the Depression, he considers his practical education as having been earned at the Clyburn branch of the public library in his neighborhood over in Merrill Park. So he became a fervent socialist, was the head of the local party, and by the time he was elected in 1948, they had ceased to be a major electoral power. The Democrats had pretty much co-opted both the rhetoric, the labor support of the old socialist coalition. So he was running virtually alone in terms of a party organization, but Milwaukeeans had been governed by socialists for so long that the red baiting done by other candidates didn't have much of an impact. Did not strike fear into the hearts of Milwaukeeans. And pictures of him, walking down the sidewalk with Agnes and the whole family of kids there. This was not not an anarchist.
You're a guy who wrote Shakespeare into modern tongue for his kids so they could understand it. He is an amazing man.
No one knows more about Milwaukee past and present than Frank Zeidler, and he is just, I think, a Class A treasure.
He is that. We got about 1 minute left. When did Milwaukee become as diverse as it has become? When was the African American movement big here?
We had a lot of European diversity. You know, one of the things that made Milwaukee somewhat unusual is the range of European groups. You know, the near-south side, it's a thicket of steeples because you have Germans and Norwegians both building Lutheran churches in the same block. But in terms of people of color, that's largely a phenomenon of the 1920s, but even more after World War II. The first Latinos and African Americans come up in the 20s, and the real growth is after World War II. And now Southeast Asians, it's becoming more and more, you know, a world city.
It never ceases to delight me. I mean, you drive around the city and it does change. Roads stay pretty much the same, but the cultural patterns change, the restaurants and all that. We have touched just scarcely the beginning of this absolutely wonderful book, The Making of Milwaukee by John Gurda. And those of you who watch the show know I don't hold up books very often, but this is absolutely worth it. It is a wonderful book, and it starts at as beginning as you possibly can and takes us up to the present time. John, thank you. It's always a pleasure to see you and have you here. Come back often. Thank you. Hope you'll come back often also to I Remember Milwaukee.